Welcome to our final, final colloquium of the year here at RuCCS. Today I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Grace Helton. Grace is a philosopher who works in cognitive science and epistemology. She has written on things like the nature of belief, the contents of perception, subjectivity in film, and why disagreement in philosophy is actually a good thing. She has a new project in the philosophy of emotion, and today we're going to hear her speak about emotional dynamics with grief as a case study. Please join me in welcoming Grace Helton.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thanks to everybody I was able to meet with today and the grad postdoc launch. Thanks everybody for that. It was super, super fun. Yes, so I am talking about emotional dynamics in the context of grief in particular. So I think, as is not perhaps surprising, grief in response to, for instance, the death of a loved one could seem everlasting and excruciating. I don't think that's shocking or news. Also, at least in popular discourse, the loss of a loved one is sometimes viewed as a life-changing event, one that one never truly recovers from. So sometimes people think you recover from it in some sense, but not in another sense. But recent evidence, especially evidence marshaled by the psychologist George Bonanno and colleagues, seems to suggest that perhaps this isn't the case. So a lot of evidence in this vein suggests that, well, of course, grief is excruciating in its early stages. It is, for most individuals, not actually very lasting. I'm going to get into the results in detail momentarily, but just to give you a bit of an intro, in a popular book on this topic called The Other Side of Sadness, Bonanno himself says of our capacity to recover quickly after, for instance, a bereavement, quote, our capacity to endure the pain of loss is not particularly special. Rather, it is one instance of our more general human capacity to thrive in the face of adversity. Bonanno actually considers rapid recovery after bereavement a good thing. He calls it, in his empirical academic work and in his popular work, resilience, right? Being resilient is a good thing. So he puts a very positive spin on what he sees in his work as rapid recovery after bereavements. In stark contrast, many philosophers who have written on this topic have concluded the opposite. They find rapid recovery after bereavement to be puzzling, startling, disturbing, or, in the words of some, regrettable, right? So you see at least one very prominent grief psychologist saying, guess what, we actually recover from bereavement much more quickly than we might have thought, much more completely, he thinks, than we might have thought. How wonderful, humans are resilient. We have a capacity to overcome adversity. The philosophers are upset about this. Apparently they would wish we grieved forever, right? I'm just kidding, but what many of them have pointed out is that grief is, at least potentially, not just the causal result of our having loved someone, but is potentially a way of caring for someone or loving someone on some views. Ashley Atkins has even defended the view that when we grieve, we empathize with the dead. That might seem impossible. How do you empathize with a person who's no longer alive? But Atkins sees this as a way of sort of appreciating the lack of what the loved one has, namely the lack of life, and that this is part of the source of our grief. Others have suggested that you can actually show love to a deceased person. Now, they can't show you love back, right? But that you continue to love asymmetrically, unreciprocated, as it were, and that grieving is a way by which your love continues, right? Not just that it's a reflection of your love, but it's a way of loving. In a similar vein, some philosophers view grief as a source of insight, a source of knowledge or understanding about the value of the lost loved one. So for these people, and this is consistent with the previous view, it's not just that grief is a way of loving the dead, so valuable as a form of love, for instance, but the grief is valuable because it tells the griever what they lost. In fact, in this kind of haunting article, Jennifer Mady argues that typically grief experiences show us sort of for the first and last time the valuable we lost, and we never really appreciate the person who's alive until they're dead. That's a very dark view, but grief is a powerful source of insight, has epistemic value, inherent value on this view. So if grief is a way of loving or a way of knowing, and if loving and or knowing something are themselves valuable in their own right, then it becomes understandable why some philosophers might find rapid recovery after bereavement actually lamentable, a sign of human frailty, even if it's not something that can be changed, as opposed to a positive marker of human resilience, as Banana would have it. It's in this context that you can see how perhaps the loss of grief is the loss of loving somebody or the loss of a source of insight. So this is the plan for the talk. I'm going to take a closer look at the empirical evidence about grief and recovery. I will suggest that far from disappearing, at least one emotion connected with grief, sadness, elicited from bereavement, persists in a particularly robust form for most subjects, persists indefinitely. And I'm going to show how this is consistent actually with the Banana results. I will further additionally argue that sadness after bereavement typically demonstrates what I call an emotional constancy effect. This occurs when two emotions can carry the exact same information, or in metaphorical terms, say the same thing, even if they have different felt intensities. Okay, so just a couple of background assumptions before I begin. I'm assuming that emotions minimally contain felt components as a part, but that they're not exhausted by those felt components. That might seem very odd, because in ordinary English, we use feeling and emotion. We use those words interchangeably. They're basically synonyms. But this follows the literature on emotion, where there's often made a distinction between feeling, or the felt aspect of an emotion, and the emotion itself. And I'm also assuming that emotions have content, a view that is amenable to several, at least some going views in psychology about what emotions are. But basically, the thing you just need to hang on to is I'm just assuming that emotions carry information in metaphorical terms, say something about the world, much as a newspaper article might be about that which it is not, or a novel might be about that which it is not. So I'm assuming emotions say something. What do they say? Well, they say something about what are sometimes called their objects. So you might fear the dog's dangerousness, their teeth, I don't know. You might be happy about the outcome of the test. Interestingly, emotions tend to feature evaluative content. In fact, some theorists, this is Nussbaum and Solomon, suggest that emotions always have evaluative content. What does that mean? They mean that emotions, though about descriptive events, right, eliciting situations or cues, construe those events, those situations, those cues as good or bad. The good or bad may not be moral. It might be aesthetically, it might be epistemically, right? Like if you're curious, that's an epistemic emotion that says that's to be pursued or to be investigated. Aesthetically might be if something is sublime, right? It might be wondrous, that's good in an aesthetic sense, not a moral sense. But sometimes emotions can evaluatively construe events in a moral sense. For instance, anger, most famously, might say that some eliciting event is a violation or was wrong, something like that. So I am assuming that often, perhaps always, emotions they don't just have descriptive content. They say that something's good or bad in a certain way. And this is going to be particularly important when I analyze sadness in the context of bereavement. So on this view, disgust represents something as disgusting. Well, of course, that may not seem very clarifying, but disgusting isn't, it's actually sort of overtly an evaluative term, right? Happiness might represent some outcome as good in some sense. Shame might represent oneself as bad in a certain sense, right? These are actually all evaluative construals, but not all of them moral construals. Okay, so let's look more closely at the empirical evidence about grief and recovery. I say that there's a bit of a puzzle here. I don't know if I want to, it's not the deepest puzzle there is. Ultimately, I think everything can be explained, but there's something a little bit funny going on in the empirical literature, at least if you casually glance at a bunch of things on grief that you might find both on the internet and in the academic literature. So just as kind of a background point here, too, grief is often reserved, that term is often reserved to talk about the process of grieving, which is highly complex, not just psychological, and may have, in fact, substantial social components, even political components, depending on the context. But even just focusing on the psychological component, grief will have cognitive components, emotional components, and more. And so this larger process of adjusting to a loss from attachment theory is sometimes called, or sometimes construed in terms of what are called stages. So these are sort of topically, thematically coherent subunits, each of which comprises multiple psychological and social parts, right? Like behavioral parts, emotional parts, cognitive parts. For instance, the stage of denial might come with it. Behavior that suggests that the griever still thinks that their loved one is alive, feelings of shock, and other elements, right? This stages model has actually been at least partly empirically validated. The point here is just that grief, understood as a process, is highly complex, even just at a psychological level, and that's not really what I'm talking about today. I'm just going to zoom in for the sake of concreteness on the emotional element of sadness in particular. This isn't to suggest that I think shock, anger, or the other emotions, or the other, I guess, cognitive or not emotional parts of grief. It's not to say that I think those are not important or not worth thinking about. They're just not the topic of the talk today, because I'm trying to draw out an aspect of emotion, which I think grief can well demonstrate. So, unsurprisingly, as we said, early grief is often extremely painful. How long do these feelings last? In popular discourse, it is a very dominant view that these emotions last, in some sense, forever. That might seem surprising, but just get on the internet and start looking for therapeutic advice about grief. This is an essay that the writer Midgley wrote for an online venue. Somebody told her at her father's funeral, they kind of shook her shoulders and said, "You will never, ever get over it." Now, I don't think you should do that to somebody at their father's funeral. That's a whole different topic. But the essay was about this phenomenon where people kept trying to go up to her and say, you don't get it, you're never going to be the same, right? This is an opinion piece by somebody, I think she was talking about the death of her sister some 3 decades prior. You can tell from the title, she says, grief is a forever thing, from a quote in the essay. We grieve forever because we love forever, right? These are just like samplings of the kind of popular discourse about grief that you will find. And by far the dominant view among grief therapists and sort of popular advice or popular discourse about grief is that it doesn't end, right? In a sense it might end, but in another sense it never ends. So on its face, at least, this seems to be in conflict with evidence that has primarily been obtained by George Bonanno and colleagues over many years. At least in terms of depressive traits, grief resolves pretty quickly. So in one landmark, much-cited study, Bonanno and colleagues assessed participants' depressive traits before the death of a spouse, 6 months after the death of their spouse, this was done in the United States, and 18 months after the death of their spouse. 11% of participants showed a pattern that I think they called it like the expected pattern or something like that, but only 11% showed it. They weren't depressed when their spouse was alive. They were depressed at 6 months, but then they weren't depressed by 18 months, right? So you might interpret this, they didn't take samples between these points, but you might interpret this as like, surprisingly, the death caused depressive symptoms, and that's why they were depressed 6 months out, but then by a year and a half out, they were indistinguishable from other controls in the population. 46% of participants were not depressed before their spouse's death, were also not depressed at 6 months, and were also not depressed at 18 months. And so the researchers, Bonanno and company, called these people resilient. It's almost half of this population that they were looking at. So what's going on? These people were never depressed, right? Oh, well, they could have been. They could have been depressed between the loss of the spouse and the first 6-month marker, right? There was nothing measured then, but I think that is actually sort of an assumption, but I know it all might be open to that maybe sort of between here where nothing was taken, they were actually depressed. But by 6 months, almost half of people are indistinguishable from controls who have not recently been bereaved. So putting together those percentages, most people by 18 months, certainly after the death of the spouse, at least in this population, no longer show depressive, if they ever show, do not show, I should say, depressive traits. You see these results extended in a lot of other contexts. So this so-called resilience result holds at least between US and Chinese populations. Some other aspects of the dynamics are actually different across these contexts. I don't want to make it seem like there aren't profound cultural differences in grief dynamics. There are, but this resilience result is pretty stable. And then you see stability across genders. So you do actually see other aspects of grief trajectories differing with gender, but this resilience result is the same. Okay, so we have the anecdotal evidence that says grief lasts forever. We have a huge body of research spearheaded by Bonanno and colleagues that says grief is very short-lived, right? Here's the other, maybe you just think, okay, there's a lot of bad information on the internet, popular mythology about grief aside, maybe people have romanticized the death of a loved one, making it out to be something more profound and significant than it really is. Let's not take the anecdotal evidence that seriously. But other evidence points to lasting effects of grief, including in non-depressed grievers. So in a couple of small studies by Mary Frances O'Connor and colleagues, we see neural evidence that people who have been bereaved, including as long as 5 years ago, are still show neural activation in areas associated with pain, and then they also report subjectively feeling grief when they are shown pictures of the deceased loved one. Not terribly surprising, but these people have been what we might call triggered, right? And are able to be triggered as much as 5 years after the death of the loved one, and this held even of non-depressed participants. So these were participants who looked resilient in the Bonanno sense, but the areas associated with pain were still lighting up when they're in the machine, and also they're also still subjectively reporting feeling grief when, for instance, they're shown a picture of their deceased loved one. Okay, let's also look at some bereavement narratives. So I'll just look at a couple of these, but I think you see across a lot of these a similar theme, which is people recovering in some sense from a serious bereavement, but also not in another sense, right? And my aim here is to try to put my finger on the senses in both those cases. So there was this piece what Bobby McIlvaine left behind that described the aftermath 20 years later of the September 11th death of a much-loved son, brother, and fiance, Bobby McIlvaine. It's a deeply researched piece, and if I could conclude one thing from it, it might be that these different family members are still grieving, but in different ways 20 years later. I'm going to focus on Bobby's mother, Helen. So she has spent 20 years since the death of her son in a support group for mothers who lost their children, what she calls her limping group, right? Like the name suggests, these people have been injured but are continuing on in some sense. But she's otherwise described as extremely high functioning, socially, emotionally, professionally. She's actually described as the most stoical of the family members. Shortly after the death of her son, she went back to work, found community. I don't want to diagnose off this piece, but she doesn't seem to have what we might call depressive traits. Rob Delaney is another case study that's worth looking at. He's an actor, comedian, and writer, and he came out a couple years ago with a very heartbreaking memoir detailing the death by brain cancer of his very young son, maybe 2 or 3 years old. And the memoir details the ongoing pain about the loss, not just when his son was diagnosed, ill, and then died, but even when he's writing it, which is nearly 5 years after the son's death. Right, so for instance, he describes a situation where several years after his son has died, he accidentally stumbled upon an early recording of his son, not looking for that, and he burst into tears. His wife walked in on him, and we don't find these people's behavior strange or unintelligible, right? He's also during this period, he had a massively successful, I think still has a massively successful career. He wrote an award-winning TV show that I think was more popular in the UK. He was writing a memoir like this. Again, I shouldn't be diagnosing people from the hard chair, but this doesn't seem to be a person who has some of the depressive traits that Bonanno and colleagues were looking for. In some ways, he's really high functioning. He and his wife actually deliberately conceived another child after their son was diagnosed as terminal, and so they're embracing life in a big way, right? But at the same time, of course, he's capable of being very upset and very sad when he's reminded of his son. I don't think we find this combination of traits very strange or unintelligible. So are people typically resilient when it comes to grief or not? The answer I want to give is that In terms of recovering from depressive symptoms, they're resilient. That's what Bonanno and colleagues are measuring, and when they talk about resilience, they're always talking about depressive traits, not clinical depression, but global mood. They have a compressed questionnaire, I think it's like, that they use, and it basically covers questions about global mood, functioning on a daily basis, and self-worth, things like that, right? So in terms of those kinds of traits, most people are recovering pretty quickly, but in terms of something else, I would call it the capacity to emotionally grasp the loss as one that is profound, I would propose that it remains intact indefinitely, and that these things are separate. So it's not surprising that you could still have this capacity for a certain kind of sadness, which marks the loss as profound, even if you aren't clinically depressed, right? Those things, even if you don't have depressive traits. Those things might go together, but they might come apart, right? So that's the least controversial thing I'm going to say. The rest is the controversial thing. But this is, so far I've just tried to make sense of what is on its face a bit puzzling about the literature on bereavement, where you have Bonanno saying, we get over it really quickly, we're so resilient, but a lot of popular discourse, also some neural evidence, also bereavement narratives, suggesting that something more complicated is going on. My suggestion, again, being that in terms of depressive symptoms, global mood. Global mood is like how often you feel sad, not what you feel sad about. In terms of motivation, can you get out of bed? Can you do your job? In terms of self-worth, do you feel good about yourself? You might not have any depressive symptoms, but retain a totally intact capacity to feel sadness about the loss. Now I'm going to argue for the controversial thing. Not only do I think that typical grievers retain the capacity to feel sad about the loss, I think that that sadness, which years on is much weaker in felt intensity, may be very rarely triggered, right? Like 5, 10 years later, maybe something you very rarely experience, nevertheless continues to say that the continued absence of the loved one is profoundly bad, not mildly bad, not moderately bad, but profoundly bad. So if I can be permitted to talk in this way, as though emotions say something, have content, are representational, the information they carry is in some sense the same, despite differences in what you might call their phenomenal or felt aspect, and despite differences in how frequently they're triggered. So this is going to be, I think, the most contentious bit of the talk. I call this effect an emotional constancy effect. As I mentioned before, I'm going to focus in particular on a certain kind, on bereavement-related sadness, and then I'm also actually focus on a particular kind of sadness. So something that's very difficult to sort of tease out in conversations about bereavement is there's so many things you're grieving if a loved one dies, right? You're grieving the loss of a conversational partner, perhaps. You're grieving the loss of a parent. That's a very specific kind of relationship. You might be grieving the loss of somebody you can have coffee with or talk to or do certain activities with. You might grieve the loss of a certain identity. For instance, maybe you were married and your spouse died, and so you're not married anymore, right? You may lose certain access to certain kinds of community you had. So there's a ton of things different people will understandably grieve in the context of different bereavements, but I want to focus to the extent possible on one kind that I don't want to say it's universal, but I think is common, which is a sadness which says that the loved one's continuing absence is bad. It's that simple. Inherently bad. It's just bad. It's just bad that they're gone. I actually kind of mean objectively bad. One might also feel sadness about some of the things I mentioned. You also might feel a separate sadness about this might sound very bizarre, but about their dying, particularly if they die painfully or suddenly or traumatically. You might have a separate grief process about that is in some sense like separate from their absence. But the thing that persists is their absence, right? Like their death is an event in the past. It's a time-limited event in the past. But what persists is like their absence, the loss of social support, and so on. Some of these things you can kind of get back, right? You can remarry. You can get new friends. You can have more social support. You can find somebody else to talk to or to play tennis with. And actually, a lot of the researchers, both in philosophy and psychology, working on this, they kind of like focus on those things you can get back to explain grief recovery. But I suspect that even though some of these things you can get back, there's still like I almost want to say like a primitive, but anyway, a sort of bare badness of their absence that you experience. And I would suggest that even this very faint intensity, rarely triggered sadness that I think typical grievers will feel even years later continues to say that the loved one's absence is profoundly bad, not mildly bad or moderately bad. Okay, let me just say more about what I mean by that. So why I think that the sadness from bereavement tends to become weaker over time? Well, kind of feels like common sense, but there is some research on this. So for instance, in the Yale bereavement study, which was the same one that partly validates some versions of the stages model of grief, you do see markers of, well, this is depression, but when they're calling depression, they meant this more of like an emotion sense, something like sadness, not depressive traits. You do see it kind of peaking in intensity and then going down, right? So yeah, people, the pain of sadness or the intensity of your sadness, at least for many people, goes down over time. It's more and more difficult to trigger that sadness over time. And thank goodness, because it would be hard to live our lives, right, if that weren't the case. There is evidence, though, there's kind of weak, limited evidence, but there's weak evidence for anniversary effects, that maybe the birthday of the dead person might be perhaps triggering, or a holiday, or something of significance. There is a bit of evidence for that, but along with this, there's evidence that a lot of people aren't triggered by these things. And basically, there's very little empirical research on what you might call grief triggers, or the eliciting conditions for feelings of, let's say, sadness in connection with bereavement many years later. Anecdotal evidence suggests, and this is why there's a picture of cinnamon rolls here, that it can be quite idiosyncratic, quite variable from person to person, and quite tied to specific aspects of the lost person. So for instance, somebody said, oh, she would bake this thing, so if I would smell cinnamon rolls walking by the bakery, that would bring up grief in me. That's highly personal, right? That's very specific to that individual. But the existence of these triggers goes along with the reality that for many or most, you don't feel as sad over time. Your episodes of sadness are triggered far more rarely, and when triggered are probably far weaker in felt intensity. They may not be, but for many people, the sadness will be less diminished in felt intensity and diminished in ubiquity as the years go by. But I will propose, nevertheless, that these rarely triggered, weak intensity episodes of sadness exhibit what I call a constancy effect, wherein they represent the absence of a loved one as profoundly, I should have just said bad, not significant, and not minorly or moderately significant. This part of my view posits that two emotions can say the same thing, even if one is of different felt intensity than the other. So if there are any philosophers in the room, this thesis is at odds with a strong representationalist or intentionalist view, according to which there cannot be this kind of freedom or potential dissociation between the felt aspect of an emotion and what it says, but I'm saying at least sometimes there can be. This effect, I named it an emotional constancy effect because very roughly inspired, very loosely, by perceptual constancy effects. There are, of course, many differences, but the idea here is that this figure occludes a larger portion of your visual field than this person, in this figure, but for many people, you represent these figures as the same size. So what these portions of the visual field say is in some sense the same, even though in some phenomenal sense or some subjective sense there's a difference. So very roughly, the suggestion is that emotional constancy is a case in which emotions of different felt intensity can nevertheless say the same thing. Obviously, there are massive other differences between perceptual constancy and emotional constancy. I do not think we should take too seriously the comparison, but it's more just to illustrate the thought that there could be two mental states which have different felt or phenomenal aspects, but which nevertheless say or convey the same thing, carry the same information. Okay, so why in the world do I say this? This is what the view is. Why would I think that a weaker intensity episode of sadness might represent the same absence of a loved one as profoundly bad as does a stronger episode of sadness? But otherwise, why would I think, for most people, right after the death of a loved one, they're of course going to be excruciating pain, have excruciating, overwhelming sadness. That sadness, on my view, says, among other things, their loss is profoundly bad. Why would I think that the very, very, very faint sadness you might have 10 years later, when you're reminded of them, still says their loss is profoundly bad. I'm a philosopher here, I'm going to do a reductio. Because it would be so weird if that weren't the case. Okay, so I have a less serious argument and a more serious argument, and this is the less serious argument. The less serious argument is, I think that if we actually just think through what would we be committed to in denying that claim, it would be hard to swallow, and then I'm going to have a more serious argument if you were just utterly unpersuaded by this. So if felt intensity and what an emotion says could not come apart in a relevant way, then think about it. The initial excruciating feeling of sadness about, for instance, your mother's death would say, if I can use that, something like, my mother's absence was profoundly bad, but over time, this weaker intensity, more rarely triggered sadness would come to say, my mother's absence is moderately bad. Indeed, at some point, this very faint, bereavement elicited sadness would come to say, my mother's sadness is mildly bad. Or sorry, my mother's absence is mildly bad. And I just find that hard to make sense of, that over time, the sadness you might feel about a bereavement, say 10, 15 years in the past, really says the same thing you might feel about sadness that your favorite coffee mug just broke, right? But maybe this is too much my caricaturizing the opposing side or resting too much on intuitions. So I'm going to give you another argument. And it's based on behavior and what I think best explains some of the behaviors we see across bereavement narratives. So let me give a different case, and I'm going to develop that in the context of behavioral explanations. So drawing on this thought that, let's say 20 years after your mother dies, you have a very weak intensity, rarely triggered feeling of sadness. Let's suppose that it does say, right, the absence of my mother is minorly bad. This would mean that this episode of sadness is the same in both feel or phenomenology and content. It would be indistinguishable from. The lost one feels after a very slight acquaintance moves away. So the thought is, suppose there's somebody that you talk to in your hallway or on your block, you don't know them very well, they seem pleasant enough. Once in a rare while, you have a little conversation with them, they've never been to your house, you like them, and they're gonna move. You might feel rather justifiably a little bit sad about that, right? But you won't do certain things that people do many years or even decades after the death of a loved one. And I think at least some of those differences in behavior suggest that there are differences in content. Okay, so let me give some examples of behaviors that, I'm now looking at people who are bereaved 5-10 years out. There's not a lot of empirical wide-scale data on this, so I'm having to sort of sort through bereavement narratives at this point. But I'm looking at somebody 5, 10, 20 years after the death of a loved one. Think, for instance, about Rob Delaney, who feels sad about his son's death, even 5 years after his son's death. He might engage, as he does describe doing so in his memoir, in certain behaviors like ritual, reminiscence, or honoring activities. For instance, he actually raises funds for an organization which helps his family, helps families with sick kids, and he still does so many years after the death of his son, right? There might be a number of reasons he does that, but you might not see it as rooted in an honoring of his son, which is in turn rooted in this kind of capacity for sadness about his son's absence. He might do things as he does do, sometimes intentionally, not accidentally, looking at old pictures. That's a very prosaic behavior, may hardly seem worth remarking on, but it's actually kind of reminiscing, telling stories about the person, like, remember when you did this? Kind of reminiscing, right? When people do this, they're cherishing, they're trying to hold in their minds somebody about it, right? When people honor, what are they doing? They're trying to like elevate or embrace or keep alive, as it were, the deceased individual. Or consider Helen McElvain, whose grief trajectory or grief journey was described in this Pulitzer-winning article. 20 years after the death of her son, here's one thing she does. Before the death of her son, she had basically no beliefs about what we might call the supernatural. She had a very secular perspective on the ultimate nature of reality. After her son's death, she became very interested in a kind of metaphysics which says that departed souls continue existing in other parts of the universe, right? It didn't go with, she adopted a new set of metaphysical beliefs, which she retains 20 years later, right? She continues to read these spiritual books, she continues to elaborate on and find comfort in this worldview. That's, I don't know what that is, maybe kind of cherishing or trying to hold her son close, right? She cannot bear, 20 years later, the thought that her son is absent. It's not like she starts with those beliefs and then she's like, oh, I don't actually believe that. She still does, right? She is delighted. She is almost like frantically happy when the journalist who did this piece reveals that she's going to be able to return to Helen the last journal that her son had been writing on before he was killed, which his then girlfriend has held for 20 years. This is 20 years later. This is a person who does not look depressed, is high functioning, in many substantial senses has moved on. She's delighted, right? That's not an indifferent response. That's not an emotionally indifferent response, and I think it's probably tied to a kind of capacity for sadness about his continued absence. We don't usually honor, reminisce, or cherish a slight acquaintance moves. I might be sad if the neighbor I really like moves, but I'm not going to develop a new set of spiritual or metaphysical beliefs that I didn't have previously to accommodate it. I'm probably not going to rejoice if I discover their journal. Now, of course, there's lots of differences between these cases, right? But this is just to say another example of a socially oriented, very weak feeling of sadness does not seem to ground behaviors that are even in the same ballpark or vicinity of the kinds of behaviors you see people engaging in 5, 10, 20 years after the death of a cherished loved one. Okay, so the constancy view I like because it allows us to avoid having to say that the weak sadness, weak intensity sadness about the absence of a loved one 20 years after they're gone says the same thing as a mild sadness one feels immediately after a neighbor moves. That's the more intuitive sort of argument, but it also accommodates evidence that episodes of sadness are less intense over time and less frequently triggered over time. And then perhaps, do I have a slide on this? Okay, maybe I don't have a slide on this. But to my mind, the behavioral evidence is the best bit of evidence. The constancy view allows us to explain why you would engage in behaviors like cherishing, reminiscing, honoring. Not everybody does all the time, but a lot of people do at least a tiny bit when prompted to, even long after the death of a loved one. And I just think that those are the kinds of behaviors that are well explained by sadness, which marks the absence of profoundly bad, not a little bit bad or kind of bad. Okay. Whoops. Okay. The constancy view, I should say, is in conflict with the thought that I previously called intentionalism or representationalism. It's in conflict with the thought that the felt element of an emotion wholly determines the content of an emotion or what the emotion says, right? There are reasons in favor of this view that I'm not going to really go over today, but this is a really well-motivated view, so this is certainly a cost. We can talk about it more if you want in Q&A. I will say, though, that the constancy view is consistent with the thought that the felt aspect of an emotion constrains, or at least partly determines, the content of what an emotion says, and that happens to be my own preferred view. So I personally do not think that there's just a totally no relationship between the felt or phenomenal part of an emotion, what emotion says. I think there's a very tight relationship, but one which can sometimes dissociate in certain ways, such as in the context of sadness after bereavement. My preferred view happens to be that emotions are partly, but not wholly, written in the ink of feeling, if I could use that kind of metaphor. But you might be very puzzled at this point. Like, I'm distinguishing between the felt aspect of an emotion and an emotion. And I'm saying that what an emotion says and how an emotion feels can come apart. But in ordinary English, the word feeling and the word emotion are basically synonyms. Feelings are emotions in ordinary English, right? But I'm following in the tradition in emotion theory, which distinguishes these and sometimes refers to emotion separately as the thing that says something and has a felt component, but is in principle separable from some feeling or some felt aspect. So the total view that one might have that is consistent with the constancy view would be something like the view espoused in the current literature by Feldman Barrett, the the view on which judgments or assessments about relevant feelings are what emotions are. You don't have to have this model of emotion to like the constancy view, but this is just to give you a sense how, psychologically speaking, the constancy view could possibly be true. I'm not committing to any model of emotions, but the constancy view says emotions have a felt aspect that doesn't exhaust what emotions are. The felt aspect is just an element, and one way that could be would be if the felt aspect plus roughly a judgment about the felt aspect are what emotions are, which is roughly Lisa Feldman-Barrett's view, right? This isn't the only way the constancy view could be true. Maybe the main thing to take away in this part of the talk is that I'm thinking of emotions as over and above the felt part of emotion. I cannot accept the view, I am committed to rejecting the view that feelings exhaust what emotions are precisely because I think the felt aspect of an emotion and what an emotion says can come apart. Okay, so let's go back to the Bonanno style results that are, have influenced so many people to think that bereavement recovery is rapid and complete. How does anything I say gel with that? Well, I actually think pretty easily, right? I'm not disagreeing with his conclusions. So Bonanno's body of work suggests that grief recovery is fast in the sense that depressive traits resolve quickly, but just to reiterate, these were measured in terms of question items concerning self-worth, daily functioning, do you get out of bed, do you shower, things like that, and global mood, which is not the same as a capacity for an emotion. How sad do you tend to be over time? How many days do you feel sad? Things like that. They didn't actually look in these studies at whether participants were still occasionally triggered to experience episodes of sadness, and certainly there's further issue I'm exploring, which is what such episodes of sadness would say, or what information they would convey is just not explored at all, not touched on by these studies. So as the case study of Delaney, Helton, and others suggest, one can still be triggered to experience sadness even if one is not depressed in that sense. This is just to reiterate or recap my basic view. At least some resilient people can still be triggered indefinitely to feel sadness about the bereavement, even though that might be much rarer and less potent. This includes Helen McIlvaine, Delaney, perhaps the people in the fMRI studies who were not depressed but were showing markers of sadness. And at least when we dig into the bereavement narratives, I think I see evidence that the sadness continues to carry the same information that the prior stronger intensity sadness carried. Okay, so which is true? Do we tend to recover from grief very quickly, as Bonanno suggests, or never, as popular discourse suggests? I think in one sense it's quick, and in another sense it's never ending, right? So the sense in which it's very quick is that in terms of depressive traits, at least a statistical majority of people across many populations look indistinguishable from controls as early as a year and a half out following bereavement. But in terms of this capacity to feel sad, and then the capacity to feel sad which still marks the loss as profoundly bad, most people retain that, is what I think. Okay, so so far I went over some of this literature that is, at least on its face, a little puzzling, where on the one hand you see like anecdotal and popular discourse saying grief never ends. You see Bonanno's research program saying most subjects get over grief very quickly. I drew from bereavement narratives and some neural results to suggest that for most grievers the capacity remains intact, and then I further argued, looking specifically at the behavioral dispositions of people in bereavement narratives, that these episodes of sadness that remain sort of available in some sense years after bereavement continue to say that the loved one's absence is profoundly bad, not mildly or moderately bad. This is what I called the constancy effect, where what the emotion says can remain constant despite changes in its phenomenal qualities. But we started with this weird disagreement between George Bonanno, the psychologist, and a bunch of philosophers, right? And the philosophers found rapid recovery after bereavement regrettable, embarrassing, puzzling, disturbing. Bonanno finds it exciting, a cause for hope, a sign of human resilience or capacity to overcome adversity. So is recovery after bereavement impressive or regrettable? I'm just gonna, I hope this is obvious, I'm just sketching a tentative reply here. I'll say that I don't think it's regrettable. Let me put it that way. recall that the reason that many philosophers find it regrettable that we seem to recover from bereavement so quickly is that if grief is a form of love, or a way of empathizing with or caring for the dead, then a loss of grief amounts to a loss of love, a loss of caring for the departed person. Or if grief amounts to a source of insight or knowledge for the bereaved individual about what they have lost, the loss of grief constitutes a loss of something of positive epistemic status, something that gives us knowledge about the world, right? So you can easily see how philosophers might see the loss of grief as regrettable in some sense, even if they understand that it's unchangeable or like practically it's good for us. I'm actually very sympathetic to the thought that grief is a way of loving the dead and is inherently valuable as such. I'm actually very sympathetic to the thought that grief is a source of insight for the griever about the significance of what she's lost. So I'm very sympathetic to that thought. But I wish to suggest that if the psychological story told is correct, then on which bereavement, or the sadness from bereavement continues to mark the loved one's absence as profoundly bad, that there is no epistemic loss in the case of the quote unquote recovered griever. There is no cessation of love because your sadness, when triggered, still marks their loss as profoundly bad. And at least in that much, something is held fixed. Epistemically, your sadness still marks the loss as profoundly bad. It doesn't hurt as much. It isn't as frequent. But you still, you might think, have some kind of emotionally distinctive insight into the nature of reality in virtue of this retained capacity. This is, of course, a very tentative or kind of speculative thought. There's a lot more to say about whether I would be correct that this kind of retained capacity for sadness, which continues to say that the loss is bad, whether that indeed is enough to continue loving the departed or to continue knowing that their absence is bad. But I'm optimistic that something like that could work. And then I could have everything I want, because I agree with philosophers about the inherent value of grief, but I'm also not disturbed by the banal results. Because I think the way in which grief persists, because I do think it persists in one way, is sufficient for us to be people who continue to love the departed person, who continue to know about the badness of their absence, even when we don't have depressive traits, even when we don't feel that sadness very often, and so on. Okay, that's it.
All right, questions? Justin.
Okay. Thank you for your talk.
Oh, of course.
So I think I'm a bit confused with what you mean by an emotion says something.
Oh, yeah.
Are you think of it as part of the content that the emotion represents? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
Sorry, I meant for, this is a weird way to put it, but what it represents for the griever, not for other people. Not what it conveys socially, is what I meant, yeah.
Okay, so there were a lot of examples.
Okay, yeah.
I'm just going to use like a
Sure,
for
yeah.
example. Suppose I lose my cat tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I hope that doesn't happen. Suppose it happens, okay.
Okay.
So from now until the end of the semester, I'll be extremely sad.
Okay.
Right, okay. Let's say 2 years from now,
Yeah.
I'll be like hopefully I'll still be sad to some extent, but maybe the sadness prompted me to adopt a new cat.
Okay, yeah.
Because I realize how much happiness my cat brings me. So in the second cat, I find the same kind of happiness and I play with her. Okay. So I guess what I'm wondering is, so for the people who say don't really exhibit profound sadness after, I don't know, 6 months, 18 months.
Okay.
What would be the mental state you're identifying as carrying?
Okay. So let me just see if I understand. So are you thinking like, okay, if my cat dies, I'll be very sad, but probably not in 2 years? Is that the thought? Or no?
Yes.
And so what would I say or think?
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, this is great. So then I would say you're not sad anymore. I would say sorry, that's more facetious than I meant. I don't think that all loss policies happen. I think it's super implausible, actually, that all bereavements or all losses involve grievers who exhibit what I'm calling an emotional constancy effect.
Okay.
I should rather qualify that I think this is an existential claim. Like there are some adults, and I actually think for close loved ones who are humans,
Okay.
I suspect that most adults do this. We don't have the empirical evidence. The empirical evidence, like in kind of survey studies of large swaths of the population that look at bereaved individuals, they stop at about 5 years to date. We don't have anything that I know of that goes 20, 30 years. You have, okay. But if you look at like the neural results, you're seeing, these are really small studies, I should say, like all of those O'Connor fMRI results are really small. But you're seeing in actually all of the participants they looked at, there's a small number, pain in what subjects call grief, even as far as 5 years out when presented with a reminder of the deceased loved one. So I think for like, let me put it this way, like a lot of adults who have lost this significant relationship with another human, there's going to be this this marker. Now, pet death, I think it really varies.
We could change the case to like say I lost a.
So sorry, what?
We could change the case. I lose a human. So
yeah, I see. Oh, I see. You lose a human. Yeah. I mean, there are many things to say. And one is, many people are not going to grieve like this. So I do think the loss has to be a close relationship. It has to be very significant, and even then, that may not be enough. So I don't mean to suggest like every time everybody loses a friend or a loved one, they inevitably or even usually demonstrate a constancy effect. But I do think for relationships that were very significant, you're typically finding that. I don't know if I understood the.
Yeah. I guess I wasn't trying to ask you to generalize the case.
I see.
Losses.
Okay. Yeah.
My question was more like I guess I'm a bit confused as in if we're talking about constancy, then what are the mental states that we say carry the same?
Oh, I see. It's just so in the cases where I do think that this is happening, it's a capacity. It's a capacity for sadness, and then the capacity for sadness remains. But then the thing that I'm saying is constant, and the thing that is going to be contentious here is like if this capacity for sadness remains over time, it's occasionally triggered, so you actually have an occurrent episode of sadness, which is different than the capacity. And then I'm going to say that even though the felt intensity of the sadness goes down, it continues to mark the loss. The sadness itself, the emotional episode when triggered, continues to mark the loss as profoundly bad, not moderately bad, not mildly bad. So the thing that remains the same is the content of the emotion, or what the emotion says. It's not the felt aspect, which will tend to go down over time.
Okay.
And that's precisely the contentious move. That's the constancy effect. Not everybody's going to.
I see. So are you thinking that the person that experiences loss had the capacity to be sad all along, but the episodes of sadness that you experience will kind of start diminishing intensity?
Yes. I'm thinking yes, thank you. That capacity, but this isn't actually the thing that's doing the work. This is not the controversial thing. The episodes will be less when you're sad, when it's triggered, like that time limited, say for 5 minutes, right? It's kind of specific duration, onset duration. It's going to have a weaker felt intensity 2 years later, probably, than it did a month after the cat died. But what stays the same, I'm suggesting, is it's going to say still that the absence of the cat is profoundly bad.
Okay.
Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jake.
Thanks, Grace.
Okay.
So in the case of perceptual constancy, you might think that when you perceive like the wall is the same color despite the variation, that the variation is not representational. It's like some other aspect of what's going on. But you might also think that it is also representational, and that like you're representing things like changes in illumination. And so you're representing some distal property, but then you're also representing these other properties. And then the constancy involves changing a bunch of that other content and yet having the same persisting representation. And so you could think of emotion this way, where you have the stuff that's changing over time is not necessarily like non-representational. It's just not representing something like the badness of the loss. It's representing other stuff. Like you could think that for example, like the level of arousal in an emotion
Yeah.
tracks things like saliency or proximity.
Yeah, yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of stuff there to be potentially represented about the event and your relation to it that could change in a way that's being registered by your emotional experience while also having the constancy.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess, like, I think this is one reason I don't want to rest too much on the comparison with perceptual constancy, because you might find things that are more reliably able to explain the constancy, for instance, like the size effect, but in the case of the sadness after bereavement, there might be things that we will ultimately uncover as good predictors of whether the sadness continues to say the same thing. And some of the things you mentioned, like how close you are to them or how much you're thinking about it, they might come in. But I suspect, I mean, this is a little bit like the Feldman-Barrett constructionist thing, but like I sort of suspect that the parameters will be far freer, like it will be way less constrained. What kinds of features can sort of imbue the sadness with the same content, where it's the absence is marked as profoundly. I don't know if I totally answered.
I don't think so. So
Okay.
what I was asking about was like the stuff that is varying while you have I'm trying to like buy them.
Oh, okay.
And so you have the constant representation of the profound badness, and then there's this stuff that's varying,
Sure,
like
yeah.
decreasing over time in
Yeah.
intensity.
Yeah.
Just wondering, could it be that the decrease over time in intensity, these other variables in the emotion, also have content? So it's not that the constancy involves like non-representational stuff in the emotion
I see.
changing
Okay.
with all of the content the same,
Yeah.
but rather this one content element is the same while other content is varying.
Yeah, okay, I think I see what you're saying. So I may be talking in a way as though I'm treating the felt component as contentless, but I'm actually trying to be neutral as to, for instance, like a format issue. I mean, I'm roughly thinking that like the arousal valence circumplex model, just for feeling, not for emotion, is not a bad one, where like the felt I'm choosing to use it just for feeling, not for emotion, where the felt aspect of the emotion can be hopefully characterized in terms of like how arousing it is, how anti-arousing, how good feeling, how bad feeling. And so I'm trying to be neutral though about whether this felt part like says anything, or I'm actually trying to be totally neutral. So I'm not thinking like it's a non-representational thing which varies, but the representational thing says the same. I'm just saying it's a phenomenal, it's a felt part of emotion, whatever that is, which varies, whereas the about the world thing stays the same. I'm trying to be neutral about format or whether they're either is representational, actually. Yeah.
So,
Great, thanks so much, Grace.
Okay.
This is wonderful. I have a few questions. Okay. I'm going to ask about where the content that the loss of profoundly bad comes from, if not from the phenomenology.
Okay.
So like a natural alternative would be functional role or something like that. And some of the data you used toward the end in arguing for your view felt like it was kind of pointing to that, like the behaviors of like raising money for charity or the kinds of reactions you'd have to find in a journal indicate that maybe there is some functional role that's giving the content of this loss. So one, I was wondering if that's where that was the direction you want to go, because I feel like there's this kind of mystery. If the content isn't coming from the phenomenology, where does it come from? But if it is functional role, I worry that it's staying constant because there obviously are changes in the overall functional role of the emotion. And this, it seems like the banana evidence is revealing part of that. So I was wondering if maybe it's a more specific kind of functional role. And this seems like a really important question, especially if we want to generalize this kind of theory, because you'd expect that like a theory of the content of emotions or what they say should, apply to lots of other cases beyond just grief. And so if that's right, then it seems like really important to be able to say where the content comes from, and if we're going to specify different kinds of functional roles, how those might be typed.
Yeah, no, certainly. Yeah, no, I can certainly see where you're thinking like, oh, the behavioral dispositions, you're leading to this thought that the behavioral differences or tendencies or functional role are the thing that sort of disrupts what you might think of as the default or standard connection between phenomenology and content, where the phenomenology fixes it. I am a little more inclined, I'm not sure, but I'm a little more inclined to go constructionist in something like the Feldman-Barrett evaluation about a feeling view. But I'm actually open to it being a functional role. I see that if it is a functional role, like of course there's some profound behavioral differences in the feeling you have at first, because that's very intense. You can't get out of bed versus 20 years later, like very different differences. But I mean, I'd be interested in, I initially wanted this to go functionalist, and I'd be interested in seeing that that worked out. But I thought it was less mysterious or something to see how the constructionist program could work, where it's kind of like a judgment or assessment or something about the feeling, and on some pieces those together are the emotion, or in some it's just like the judgment about it that is the emotion. And that gives you like some freedom for the judgment to be different from the felt intensity, or the quality and intensity of the emotion. But it doesn't make the emotion unconstrained by the felt aspect. So I would repudiate a view on which like a highly arousing, painful emotion could be an emotion of happiness that says something's good. I would reject that view, right? So this is what I meant when I said, like, I think emotions are written in the ego feeling, they're partly determined by the felt, right? But I see what you're saying about the functional, it's like, which functional role do I appeal to? I don't know, because I like the functionalist view better than the constructionist view, but I think maybe constructionism makes it more easier how it could be the case as a just so story about how it could possibly be the case that there's different aspects of the felt quality. I suspect, though, that still the functional role plays some kind of connection with the felt quality, because of course the felt quality is way more intense right after bereavement, and the functional role somehow seems tied. I don't know what the tie is to the, you can't get out of bed, and then the thing's way weaker, and then right, you're not depressed anymore. So I'm not sure if I think there's a connection between the functional role and the felt quality, but maybe, I don't know, like maybe the least weird way to make sense of this view would be constructionist.
Can I press one and follow up, or should I
Many ways.
Thanks.
Uh,
Yeah, thanks for this offer. This is great. I just wanted to invite you to say more about why you thought the content that the loss was profoundly bad is objective rather than
Oh, I see. So ask me about that, yeah.
right, and in part because of my own curiosity, and in part because in thinking about some of your cases and some of the sort of supernatural things that people do as a response to profound loss and grief, what seems to me at least to constrain them in the case of what I might call not profound loss, like your neighbor moves away, is much more related to sort of like social inappropriateness than it is to like what I sort of rate their feelings as, you know, like so it, like it could be the case that, you know, my neighbor moves away and my other neighbor is like displaying all of the features of heartbreak, you know, and I could like understand that they are displaying all the features of heartbreak, and there's still some extent to which I'm like, well, I think whatever's happening there is socially inappropriate, such that like one should not go into their old apartment and collect notebooks. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And so I was hoping to comment on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, the contrast is a little silly because, of course, there's all kinds of things you shouldn't do to an acquaintance that would be fine to in the memory, in the name of your mother's memory or something. But to go back to like because I think you were wondering why do I think it's a sense in which it's objectively bad, or
right. Well, because yes, and so on that point, I think part of what I was thinking, well, sure, it doesn't seem like it's the case that my mother's death is mildly bad and stop. But it certainly might be the case that 25 years out, my mother's death is mildly bad for me. And I don't find that a terribly difficult pill to swallow. Yeah. And so I was just curious as to why you were sort of beating the objective.
Yeah, no, maybe, that's like the slippery issue there, and I should not even have opened it, is just that some people, psychologists and philosophers alike, think, no, all of this is explained by the altered significance for you of the absence of a loved one. And the significance just changes. And you don't mark their continued absence as profoundly bad because it doesn't have the significance for you. Maybe you're remarried. Maybe you have other conversation partners, right? And so there have been a lot of people trying to push on the idea that once it's significance for you that's relevant, that significance, like say, let's call it practical significance or maybe personal. Some people think maybe it does change. And so I'm not quite sure what to think of that, but the thing I'm trying to get at is that I feel confident that some kernel remains the same, something that marks their absence as bad. And I'm not sure if it's bad in terms of like your practical life. Right? I'm not quite sure, but you can mark like it's in virtue that's causally enabled by your intimate connection with them that you had, that you can like mark the objective badness of their, my Kantian side is showing up here, the objective badness of their continued absence. So this is sort of what I was trying to implicitly respond to, somebody who says like, no, the significance just changes, and you don't mark it as bad. That bad. Because it's like on a day-to-day level, or in some sense, like it practically not very significant.
There's more questions, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Paul. Thanks. I'm trying to get my head around the philosopher who tells me it's somehow regrettable
Yeah.
to be really grieving, let's say, less than a year.
Yeah.
And my puzzle is like twofold. One, I'm just trying to get a feel of what possible mechanism they'd be envisioning.
I see.
Because like for creatures like remotely like us, I'd imagine that these intense feelings are going to like have to respect something like a behavior condition.
Yeah.
Right? So that the metaphor of distance doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
And then it just seems like, well, like how could it possibly be that it would be that intense to start and then not fall off by orders of magnitudes as we're going?
Yeah.
And then I'm also just trying to get a feel for like what would be the less regrettable situation.
Yeah.
So like is it that like, you know, a child loses their parent and they should be like traumatized for the rest of their childhood?
Right.
Is it that every time you have this one of these loss, right? Maybe, you know, you only get like, I don't know, 80 years or so.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so I'm just trying to figure out like I just want to get a feel for
what are they talking about?
Why does anybody say this?
Well,
how bad should I feel it for how long?
how long should you feel bad? Yeah. I don't think any of these people. I have mine with Gary Marusich, Dan Mueller, Aaron Smuts, other people who take this regrettably concern, or even people who disagree with them who take it seriously enough to worry about it. I don't think any of them think of it as an action guiding or that the regrettability assessment requires even the nomically possible existence of a counterfactual need, and which is a very bizarre thing to say, but I don't know that it's more bizarre than what Bonanno is saying in his popular writing, but it's also implicit in his academic work. He calls the people who get over it resilient. That's valuable, right? He thinks they're awesome. He thinks we humans are awesome and we like get over adversity and it's like so amazing. So I don't know, maybe we shouldn't take that too seriously or whatever, but I think he's maybe it's just like a half, whatever, he feels a positive gloss about this. He thinks it's an impressive aspect. Whereas maybe the better way to put it in terms of what regrettable people are saying is like, this is a marker of human frailty. Like we might think of other things that we think of as an embarrassing or disturbing, like, you know, the human propensity for extreme senseless violence, right? Like maybe there's no way we can like, as a species level, not have that, right? But maybe you could still say it's regrettable, not in the sense that there's like a counterfactual population of humans who at the species level lacks it, but that is just like a marker of human frailty or something like that. So I think it's not even meant to be action guiding. It is not meant to be required. The claim, which I agree would be super bizarre, that like we could be otherwise, or it's even like nomically possible or psychologically possible, but it would be a different thing. So, I mean, I'm disagreeing with these people, but I think their claim is intelligible and worth criticizing. So I'm kind of, you know, building up status.
So my question is in the vicinity of my own question that has to do with content. I'm very quickly. So
that content is hosted at least in part somewhere else in some other features of
Yeah.
Notion.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had a view about what that feature was. Or
I see. Okay, I'm going to go back to the toy view, and I feel a little bit embarrassed to do this because I don't know that this is that plausible, but the toy view is just like the feeling and the judgment about the feeling is the emotion, and the judgment generates the content. So the judgment is constrained about the kind of judgment it could be based on like how arousing or pleasant or unpleasant the felt aspect is. But within this, there's wiggle room for this to be like, this is really bad, or this is moderately bad, or this is minorly bad, or other flavors of difference.
Right.
So I think the quickest toy version of what could be happening would be, it's a judgment about the feeling which somehow generates what I'm calling the content. You don't have to have this feeling. You can think it emerges out of the feeling plus a functional role. There are other, emerges in a sense that it's not like a priori predictable from each of the parts. And so there's all things you could say. I don't have much specific to say in terms of like the model, but it's a great question. Like, well, where's the content? Like, where does it come from? Yeah.
Could it be in the mere capacity for sentence itself? Like,
Oh.
regardless of intensity, just
Oh.
the fact that you
Yeah.
continue to have the capacity for sadness might index the
Yeah.
degree of profundity, even if you
I see.
experience that sadness.
Yeah, I see. I mean, I don't know if I would be, I was kind of thinking that the capacity for sadness is like, sort of that which underlies the current episodes, right? Like, it's like I'm capable right now of feeling very sad about this and that, but I'm giving a talk, so I'm not letting myself access that. But in 5 minutes, I'll go cry in the bathroom. So, but the capacity is still here right now. And so I wasn't thinking, I see, so like I think there is a deep way in which it is tied to the constitutively tied to the capacity for sadness, because that's ever present, but I don't know, the capacity is supposed to be what underlies the ability to have like episodes of specific emotions that are felt.
Right.
I don't know if that.
Yeah, I guess my thought was just that the capacity could be in some sense.
Yeah, oh, I see, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I do think, I think it should be, it's a capacity for sadness, so it's somehow constitutive to the range of contents you can have when you're having the current episode. Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not sure how, in some sense that's right, I just don't know how explanatory it would be. It's like, well, what explains why the capacity can, on my view, sometimes make it the case that the same felt intensity thing says that this loss is moderately bad versus minorly versus profoundly. So in some sense it all comes down to capacity, and episodes have to be, I think, understood constitutively in terms of the other, but I'm not exactly sure. Yeah.
Thanks. Really enjoyed the talk. I think the last response might have actually dealt with a big part of my question,
Okay.
but I think I want to ask it just in case I'm not connecting the dots in the right way, which is, I'm curious how a change in a person's evaluation of a past event might be reflected in their emotion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This is like
I
a
kinda wanna
one-shot
go to
nostalgia. Okay. Wait, so how the person's evaluation of the past event?
Yeah, so like if
Oh.
the content itself changes over time. So for example, my evaluation or my relationship to a particular event might change.
Yeah.
Especially on the timescales that were brought up, we're talking about 5, 10, 20
Yeah.
years.
Okay.
My relationship to the event might change, so the content,
Definitely.
or at least the evaluation, it feels like
Yeah.
should change. So I'm kind of curious
Okay.
how that would be reflected in the emotion, or how you think it could be
Yeah.
reflected.
So there is kind of like a view actually in this literature that's really quite simply like, well, we don't mark it as significant. We don't mark the loss as equally significant as we did 5 years ago, just because the time lost is 5 years in the past. I just don't think that that's empirically realistic as to people who can actually feel grief about like their wife who died 20 years ago, even though they're remarried happily. But there is like, some people do suggest that it's just like a purely temporal
Like a
thing.
decay.
Yeah, like it just sort of, and maybe this is not what you mean, but there are tons of cases that are not going to pattern in the way I've suggested, where you discover somebody you loved is not the person you thought, like after they died. Or in the opposite direction, I had somebody, after I gave a talk like this, say that they lost their best friend in high school when they were teenagers, and her grief had actually gone up over time, because when she was 18, she didn't understand what her friend had lost. Like, she didn't really get it. But then when she went to grad school, got married or whatever, at each milestone, she would kind of like appreciate more what her friend had been deprived of. So you might even see like patterns that are kind of like reversed to it, and maybe that's not what you're interested in, but like definitely also the patterns will be highly variable depending on, like the significance might change for a lot of reasons. But if there's like somebody that really loved, you don't find out they were a horrible person, everything else is the same, I think often you see this retained capacity for things.
Yeah, I think I have a related question to the last two, which is that I'm thinking about, so I'm thinking about how, so what do you think about the idea that, you know, part of the content of the profound badness is generated from the initial, the initial feeling and how bad that is, and then the later feelings is sort of like a little memory trace back to you know how bad that was, right? Which might suggest that it's that initial feeling of grief that determines that content, and then it's like a memory trace back to that. Which means if like in the case you just gave of the best friend dying, right? Like if that hadn't increased in intensity, then maybe it would not have felt as profound, right? Because your initial feeling of grief was not actually that bad, or whatever.
I love that. I love this. So it's like a shock to the system, and that somehow, maybe I don't even need the weird judgments. Just somehow it's just like
a little trace back thing that stays in memory or in some pathway somewhere.
I love that. So this is part of a larger project that I want to talk about sadness from bereavement, also horror in response to trauma, and awe, and there's so very intense big emotions.
Cool.
And I think I kind of like think in a lot of these cases you see these constancy effects, like not all the time, but they can happen. And I think I initially thought, maybe I should still think, I don't know, that it's like these like the shock of the huge intensity emotion somehow leaves its print on everything to follow. I still kind of like that idea. Some people have suggested to me though that like, I think I told somebody this at lunch, that like for instance, somebody said that, oh, you know, this person's in their 30s now, but they tripped in front of their class when they were seventh grade or something, and they were saying they felt really embarrassed, and they were saying like, they thought they could still, in remembering it, feel it as embarrassing, even though, I don't know. So like, there are people who are trying to convince me that like weaker intensity emotions could have like a little flavor or like a trace, but I will say like I initially thought like these are like the big life-altering emotions, and maybe that gives me another mechanism too for like what's going on. But I mean I love the idea. I'm not that's maybe what I want.
Also, embarrassment for a 7-year-old can be pretty intense, but
that's actually a good point. A seventh grader.
Yeah, seventh grader. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Mark. Thanks. The best moment for this might have passed, but I'll say it anyway. But several times we've been talking about, you know, what the content of these emotions are, and where that comes from, and what does it, the part of it comes that's not the feeling. That's the rest of it. I wonder if you want to, or should consider that there might be some propositional content, some language-like content. So you did gloss it as, you know, the absence of the loved one is bad. Well, that's a sentence. You know, maybe we could take that seriously. And if we look at it from that component, well, then we can say, well, the propositional content stays the same, even though all the emotions kind of change over time. And your question of why doesn't the intensity matter? Well, that from this perspective, that would look like, you know, is the representation iconic? So you're basically saying, you know, a lot of grief should represent a lot of value or something like that. But I can also say, you know, my loved one was really, really awesome, and that's a sort of a non-iconic way of having the same kind of content. We know from language that it's not necessarily an all or nothing kind of thing, that you can have iconic things that you know, in language too, so you can manage blending them, but that might be a model for what the non-iconic part of it is that's...
I mean, I think it loops to Jake's question a little bit, like I mean, I do think the kind of way I presented it is inviting a view on which the phenomenal or felt aspect of emotion, I don't know, it's non-representational, I don't know what it is, like format-wise, and then there's sort of a judgment about it, and that's where the content is coming in. I'm open to the idea that it is propositional. I'm open to the idea that it's not, or one is and the other isn't, so long as there's like a freedom between them is the main thing I'm saying. But I'm open to the idea that the content itself is actually propositional, but I think I can be, like, if it should turn out actually no, I don't know, emotions are like drawings and like they depict, but let's say not propositionally, I think what I'm saying here, I'm hoping that could fit in that framework too.
Well, we also know that words in English and other languages that name emotions can go with clauses, right? You know, it's meaningful to say.
Oh, sure,
I'm sad that, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and then certainly like that's, the philosophers certainly talk about, Nussbaum and Solomon, et cetera, they always, certainly talk about the emotions as though they're propositional. It's not that I'm against that, I'm just trying to be as neutral on that as possible for the constancy claim, and then other people can tell me how like, actually other models do or do not fit with the constancy claim. Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, this is really outside my wheelhouse, and therefore very interesting.
Oh, great.
But it got me thinking about a lot of stuff, and I'll admit that I don't have, I guess, like a typical emotional experience, but something in one of the stories I thought was really intriguing and maybe confounding. You told a story about the woman whose son died in 9/11.
Yeah.
And then years later, she sort of, I guess, talked herself into metaphysical.
Sorry, I think I described that badly. She initially just talked herself into them, and then she retained them for 20 years.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. And the belief was that maybe he was living, or his soul was living somewhere very
like,
distantly.
Has been unfurled in a different part of the universe. Like, I don't know what the metaphysics, but it was like,
sure.
Yeah.
And that really struck me as odd, because I think throughout the talk you talk a lot about, the grief, what the grief says. The person's absence is profoundly bad.
Yeah.
And if it's the absence that is profoundly bad, I don't know what is resolved by imagining that they exist somewhere else that you will never have access to. Because they're still exactly as absent as they were before.
Yeah, got it.
And so I'm wondering if there's something like absence versus remoteness.
Yeah.
I'm trying to imagine like I'm shipwrecked.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'll never see anybody again. Would I grieve them in the way that I would grieve them if they died? Is that equivalent?
No, I love this. This is very, okay, I see what you're saying. You're saying, well, strictly speaking, her grief probably doesn't say his absence is bad, because she believes he's present somewhere, right?
Well, but he's not present.
Well, sorry, not here. I can't remember if it's like she thought he's in a different dimension, but yeah, so maybe it's like the absence is like absence from me or absence from this realm, because it's not like she thinks he's like living in Poland,
But that's another case, right? What if he did move to Poland? It's like, and I can't really come back. And Would that be grieved like death?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I don't know. Would you grieve that as though they had died? No, probably not.
There are philosophers who actually, they'll be like, what if somebody was sent off and you're never going to contact them? There's these, they try to get at the content of grief. I'm assuming there's a pluralism, and there could be sadness, if somebody is shipped away and you'll never see them again, there's no technology or whatever. But it does bring up something interesting, because people often find comforting, beliefs in the afterlife, or Helen McElwain's belief in the continued existence of her son in a different realm than this one. But it's, there's some, he's not in our world.
There does seem to be some component of just feeling bad that the person doesn't exist.
Yeah,
right?
I see.
So that you would be assuaged by knowing, I guess they exist somewhere, even if I can't benefit from that or experience it.
Yeah. Maybe we were pointing to is actually it's absence from this world, because many people believe in an afterlife, heaven, whatever, separate from Helen McElwain, but that's not, those people, I haven't seen any evidence, let's say, that believing in that actually.
That's the other question, right? Is does that belief actually change the content of the grief at all? It doesn't seem like it does. They're still sad, right?
Yeah, people are, the only thing I can think of offhand is something that looked at prolonged grief, when they were trying to find predictors of whether you will have grief that's much longer in its depressive manifestations than is statistically typical. They didn't find any difference in attachment. I don't think they did with religiosity. They didn't find any differences with how happy the relationship was. I don't know any evidence that suggests that religious people grieve less.
Can I ask a related question?
How about perception? Hi. I was wondering if you had anything more to say about the terrible person.
The terrible person? Sorry.
Yeah, so the scenario, it came up in the conversation, scenario where you grieve for someone and then you discover later on that they're actually
Oh,
a
yeah,
terrible person.
okay.
Or maybe like more relatedly,
Yeah.
I don't know, you discover that they didn't even know who you were, or
Sure.
didn't really care or whatever.
Your relationship is, yeah.
Yeah, and so like I guess the broader question is, to what extent does this model
Yeah.
account for this kind of belief change? Or
Yeah.
change of the person?
No, it's a great question. I mean, what I was trying to say, that I don't know if it came across, was that I think that this model only holds for, not even all, but many, maybe most grievers who had, a significant reciprocated relationship, which was not disturbed then by further information. So obviously, like, this is human life and it's highly variable, so I'm not presuming that you're going to keep feeling that sad even when you discover they betrayed you in their life or something like that. That's just to say, like, I think that it was quite limited to it.
Yeah, I guess if it was going to be cashed out in terms of like a memory trace,
Okay.
you might expect it to.
Oh, I see. Oh, interesting. Oh, okay. So you're bringing this with Michelle's thing about like, well, is it the explosive power of the original emotion and then it traces? Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know a lot of evidence about that, and I don't know that I've looked at any bereavement narratives. I'm sure there are some that speak to like, the closest thing I can think of is Polina Pliskova, like she lost her husband and then like he cut her out of the will or something, and it was complicated, and I think the only thing I remember is like it was complicated, right? She still loved him, and then I also think they divorced, like I don't know. But yeah, like I see, so you're saying like if it's just the punch of the original memory, shouldn't it be, or sorry, the original emotion that becomes a memory trace that explains persistence, shouldn't that like you still feel sort of like relevant feelings? Does that mean maybe? I think it's just like an open empirical question about like there's a different thing that's complicated grief, this like elaborate change status grief, and that just that's everything.
I have a question.
So, in intense feeling,
Yeah.
I'm not going to say the emotion to have the content doesn't usually later on. But do you think that there is an initial period in which you must have that feeling in order to the association and the event itself?
Oh, yeah, I think that relates to Michelle's question. I mean, it does seem, I'm not sure. I think this is like an empirical question. I mean, let's see. There's some evidence of delayed grief. Bonanno and his other research passed out that it's as pervasive as people think. There's a kind of popular therapeutic perspective that's like, if you're not grieving a lot at first, there's something wrong with you, you're delaying, you're repressing your grief, it'll come out later. So maybe that's the closest I can think of an example where people actually don't have that initial reaction, and the traditional sort of psychodynamic view is like, oh, but they're going to, right? It's repressed. Some of his evidence sort of casts some doubt on that. I don't know it very well, but I think it's a great question, and tied to Michelle's about whether this is a good model. Like it does. I mean, it seems bizarre just offhand to think that you could have no grief response, and 20 years later, I mean, maybe the closest I can think of realistically that some people think it was delayed grief.
All right, let's thank Grace.
Thank you so much.
Please join us for